We're going to try and answer an impossible question tonight. What is drawing? I mean, a couple of things I think all of you know. It's like drawing is pretty much all you guys are doing every day at the moment, apart from a brief thing to go home, maybe buy some food and sleep. But is what we're doing here really drawing? First thing is, we're here, we're going through, let's say, an academic preparation in drawing. So this probably looks like hideously familiar to a few of you already. On the right, we've got a drawing by Tintoretto. This is kind of, let's say, a different version of the next stage. So Tintoretto, for those of you who know his paintings, this was his version of a cast drawing. So he, rather than doing plaster casts, would draw from bronze statues. He was interested in the way that light lifted off things. And so a lot of his paintings are figures in very dark, murky backgrounds with sort of slashes of white and violent color. So rather than looking for, let's say, masses, he was interested in the glints of light on things. But still, this idea of learning to draw, or an artist using drawing as a form of research by studying the art of the past, whether it's part of an arm from a classical sculpture or Michelangelo. This is actually a Michelangelo. This is part of the Medici chapel here. It's a very foreshortened sculpture. So we've got drawing as a means of learning, like an academic preparation, and that's a pretty familiar form of drawing, I think, for all of you. The other thing is we're here in Florence, and if you stand outside the Accademia, and particularly the building to the left of it, what you'll see is above the door there are three interjoined rings, and it was the Accademia delle Belle Arti del Disegno. And the three rings, one ring represents painting, one ring represents architecture, the other ring represents sculpture. And the fact they're all linked is they're linked through drawing. And the word for drawing in Italian is disegno. And it has a double meaning. It means literally drawing as in the physical act of making a shape, but there's also the hugely important thing of drawing there's a secondary part, or not even secondary, an equal part, which is the idea of designing or arranging. So, this sensitive translation of nature, but also, arrangement, composition, playfulness as well. I just want you to think about all the different types of drawing that occur. For example, this is a Giulio Romano, a Mannerist Italian artist on the right. This is a Roman, part of a Roman temple that was excavated in Florence. Drawing is also deciding how big these letters are going to be, the spacing between the letters, how thick the things are. Drawing is making the ram, deciding how many different pieces of foliage are going to be in this kind of hanging pendant piece here. So there's so many different types of drawing to consider. What we're looking at and what we're doing on a daily basis here is really quite a narrow part of it. Drawing again, not just the leaf, but the space between the leaves. Or on this other side, this is something called pietra dura, which is a sort of a Florentine speciality. The actual act of not just the design for this in the first place, but even to actually be able to cut these different pieces in a precise and specific shape is a form of drawing. If I was talking to Mitch, who runs the sculpture program earlier, he was saying that the more he sculpts, the more he feels that literally is just everything he does is a form of drawing. So the first sort of job this evening is just to expand our sense of what drawing is. Does anyone know what this is? Does anyone recognize this? Okay, this was made in what's now Nigeria, in around the year sort of 1480, and at this point, there's a series of these sculptures. They're now called the Ife heads because this was the place where they came from. It's just people assumed for a long time that this tribe had been trading with maybe ancient Greece or Rome or had some contact. There was absolutely none at all. But again, even just extending our notion of drawing, just actually the idea of designing and arranging these lines on the face, again, is a form of drawing. Drawing is also playfulness. Drawing can actually just be fun, which again, might be a hard thing to believe when you're on week 4 or 5 of a Barg drawing. This is a Bernini portrait of his friend and patron, Scipione Borghese. And you have to be on pretty good terms in the 17th century to draw a cardinal this way. I mean, the risk of being decapitated or tortured, or it was an offense, it's called lèse majesté, to offend someone in power. And that crime existed in 17th century Rome. So unless you really know the guy pretty well, you're taking a risk to draw a powerful public figure in that way. Can anyone guess who that is? Sorry? No? It's a real figure, it's a historical figure. Yeah, it's Queen Victoria. And this was drawn by John Singer Sargent, who saw her going past his lunch table and quickly just sketched it onto the bit of paper he had lying around. So this is in the carriage. So this is drawing as fun as well. We're here making these very serious, very wrought drawings, but I think the other thing is that it should actually just be an enjoyable activity to pick up a pencil and paper. And these are Benini and Sargent in different ways were some of the more kind of, let's say, serious, grand manner artists who've ever existed. And this is the kind of thing they did too. At the end of each trimester here, for those of you who are new, there's a final critique where you bring everything you've done. And to begin with, the focus is very much on the serious projects. But over time, it's so gratifying and so important that students begin to bring their own things, both serious projects, playful things. And it actually becomes quite disturbing if you're getting towards the end of a student's time here and they're not bringing things that they're doing outside. It's very difficult to kickstart that impulse from nothing after 9 trimesters. And just to see a student sketchbook where there are developed drawings, but also the idea of just drawing for fun, drawing to play, to me is an incredibly important thing to see. And here are 2 historical examples of it as well. I think the other thing is just to think about in terms of drawing as well is that the things you're doing now, there's this big question, is sort of student work art? My own feeling is, and please don't take this the wrong way, no. But what you are learning to do, and this is really important, is all the drawings you're doing, and even the first Barg drawings as well, they contain artistic decisions. So you're learning to make artistic decisions, and that is ultimately what works of art are made out of. And this is the joy of one of these sheets, I think, by Raphael, is again that sense of play, and we can move a little bit closer as well. But this is a series of artistic decisions. Changing the angle of a head, changing the shape of the top of a head, changing the tilt of a face. We can go back and see the whole thing. Sorry, this is not Raphael, this is Leonardo da Vinci, sorry. And you can just see him, you can just see this kind of fertile, curious, restless brain at work over this whole sheet. Get up, get back a little bit closer again. Possibly some kind of pencil work underneath. We can see ghosts of heads that we couldn't see before under here. But it's this restless thing. And so the Florentine tradition, it's so nice that Simona's sitting at the back here, because in this tradition we have, which to some extent is, let's say it's an American school with a grounding in the French academic tradition, but we're here in Florence. And there's a Florentine link through painters like Annigoni. And for those of you who are in Simona's program, which I think is all of you here, it's a real privilege for you to be taught by someone who has that direct link to the Florentine tradition of drawing. And the last great exponent of it in the city was Pietro Annigoni. And this way of working through a problem on paper is very much the Florentine way. If you get up to Venice, Titian, he'll evolve the painting on the canvas, but the Florentine way is rooted in this idea of disegno. Titian draws too, but this idea of working out the problems on paper, not completely, but to a large extent before the painting or sculpture starts. I think this is if you talk about drawing, this is a very easy thing. We know this is a drawing, if that makes sense. We're going to look at a few, like, what is drawing now in terms of materials, the appearance of the thing. So this is a drawing by Thomas Lawrence, who's a British painter at the end of the 18th, early 19th century. It's done on paper with materials that we would recognize as drawing materials, like a chalk. Just out of interest, does anyone want to volunteer a definition of what drawing is? What do you think? I think it's a really interesting question, because I think, and then think of if we go back to the images at the start, think of some of these, and think of the different types of drawing, or the nature of what disegno means of drawing and arrangement. So yeah, anyone want to volunteer? Yeah, great.
Yeah, I think drawing is kind of language to express your opinion.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, great, okay. So what's the difference between drawing and singing?
Singing?
Yeah, singing. If I was going to sing, I'm also expressing my opinion through a form of language. So what makes drawing distinctive?
A different way. It's visual.
Yeah, okay, so there's a visual or an aesthetic. So, okay, yeah. Anyone else want to have a go? I really don't think there's a right or wrong one. Yeah, great.
I would say maybe describing form through line.
Okay, I want to challenge you, so I'm going to challenge you with this.
But that may be a painting.
Okay, but this is the next question. So we're going back to this. So what makes a drawing? So is it let's say if we limit drawing to materials. So if for example, does anyone know what this is on? The material this is on? Can you guess?
Rice paper.
Nope. Nope. Much harder. Marble. Yeah, good. So this is on marble. So I remember that actually a colleague here put something on Instagram saying, drawing is marks on paper. And I immediately went, because I'm really pedantic. Maybe it's being a son of a lawyer or something, horrendous curse like that. But drawing is absolutely not limited to, marks on a pencil in paper. This is red chalk on marble. This is a Japanese screen. And again, I think, for me, that's an act of drawing. Or it's the disegno impulse. And this piece of marble is actually slightly curved. I mean, it's flat, but no, I think we're getting somewhere though. I mean, the broader we can make it, the better. And I think the idea of, let's say, let's move forward to, this is a Turner drawing. Again, does drawing have to be, if we're thinking about materials again, can a drawing be done with a brush? I mean, there's this, we might ask, this is on paper, so we're getting halfway there. This is a little Turner study of Venice. Is it a painting? I don't know. Well, because there's some people that call it drawing. And also, I mean, the word for, even in the 19th century, when Sargent was studying, the word for a paintbrush is actually the pencil. It's used throughout Reynolds as well in English. So I think, again, the more, and I think even as students sometimes, especially when people make that transition from painting to drawing, the more you think of painting as an extension of the drawing process. It's a different type of drawing, but the more you do it, the more you realize they overlap. I mean, it's okay. Does anyone know who made this, by the way? Sorry? No? A bit earlier. Go way back. Think more like, so it's someone called Claude Lorraine. So 17th century Frenchman living in Rome. And he made these very complicated, very classical landscapes, but he did lots of drawings outside. There was a friend of mine who studied here for a while called Poppy, who had a master's from the Courtauld. And I thought, well, she was the most recently graduated art history student in the room. And I asked her whether this is a painting or a drawing. There is no answer, actually. But drawings can be done with a brush. These are Claude Lorraine pen studies. It's a similarly liquid medium. This is definitely done with a brush. Or there might be little moments with a pen in it. I think maybe we're more comfortable calling that that's definitely a drawing, maybe. This might be. But again, I think that, again, the more broadly we can approach and understand these things, the better it is. And these are so beautiful. When you see Claude Lorraine's paintings, you don't necessarily immediately, because it seems, let's say, to some extent artificial or idealized, you don't realize how much nature is in them. But when you see the drawings, you really understand how deeply he looked at, at foliage, at the way that, ivy wraps around a tree trunk, the way a path kind of bends back into space. And he's kind of the father of landscape painting. He didn't really paint outside very much. He drew outside and then painted in a more contemplative way inside. It's the romantic poet idea, the idea of emotion recollected in tranquility. So he'd be outside, he'd feel something in nature, he'd make these drawings, and then he would try to organize those thoughts into paintings in his studio. Does anyone know who made this? So Florence, high Renaissance, kind of the crazy inventor. We've seen him already. This is Leonardo da Vinci. And again, this is another interesting thing. So this is most of this is done with a brush, and it's on linen, so to some extent canvas. But it's always, if you could look in catalogs of his work and everything else, it's always, we're told that this is a drawing. So this is, when we paint here, we tend to paint with brushes on canvas. This is done using the same materials, but it's classed as a drawing. So again, this is also the idea of drawing as preparatory works. This is the study of drapery. And the other thing that I think is really interesting, this is another thought I want to have you to have in your head, is this idea of drawing having a purpose. And so this is a drapery study, and it's painted or drawn on linen. So there's this connection between what he's drawing, the subject, and then the materials he's actually drawing on the linen. And this is a back by Michelangelo. In this case, it's on paper, but Michelangelo did a lot of drawings of the body on vellum, which is skin. And so there's this amazing holistic connection between the subject matter and the materials used to make the drawing. And again, when Leonardo was drawing his landscape drawings, he often worked on more like wood pulp paper. So this idea of thinking about, what am I going to draw? What am I going to make to use it? You know, how big's the drawing going to be? What's the purpose of the drawing? How finished does it need to be? So again, you're not necessarily, when you're here, always going to be making art, but those are profoundly artistic decisions that you learn to make and learn to, just to be aware of. You know, it's part of your process, and in the end, you know, there's one school of philosophy that says more or less that we are the sum of our choices, and I think being aware of the choices you can make is such an important part of, you know, development as an artist. Okay, so again, we're now going to think about, we've thought a little bit about like what is drawing. We're now going to think about a few different types of drawings. This is the 17th century Spanish artist called Ribera. And I think what's interesting when we look at art of this particular period, when we think of Ribera's paintings or, you know, people like Van Dyck and Velázquez, we sense this relationship to nature, but there's always this feeling of formula. So when Ribera was learning how to draw, he would have partly drawn from the model, but he would have also drawn from these copybooks. So he'd have learned how to construct an eye, and he would have these are his copies from a pre-existing set of patterns. So he approached nature, you know, directly, but also with an idea of, to some extent, a preordained form as well. And we can see this is a close-up of some mouths, and I've turned this upside down, and this is part of this is his Marsyas, which is there's an exhibition I saw in London. This is a man who's being flayed alive by Apollo. He's having the skin of his legs ripped off with a very, very sharp knife, and he's screaming, so he's being played almost like a musical instrument. And I think it's fairly obvious the relationship between these types of studies and the finished thing here. So we can go back. You can see the eyes up here. And just how much form there is, the way that the eyelid moves over the round structure of the eye and the calligraphic quality of the marks themselves. I think these are really interesting. You know, it's not part of our course of study here, but, you know, for those of you interested either historically or just in terms of, let's say, stylistically, the types of painting that was being made in sort of the middle of the 17th century, a big part of the aesthetic came from the study of these sort of pattern books. And then, you know, back to Florence. The original now is in the Opera del Duomo, which we're not going to be able to see for a while. There are some very indifferent copies on the actual door. And it's so rare to see a drawing this old. That's the other, you know, because paper, you know, one of the reasons you see all those scribbles on the Leonardo was paper was a precious commodity. And paper also, you know, degrades much faster than, say, bronze. So this is a drawing from, you know, more or less 1400. And this is the North set of doors for the baptistry. They're my favorite set because they're the most sculptural of all of them. And this is the scene, this is the flagellation of Christ. And so we can see here what these very, let's say, small, this sheet of paper is about that size. Energetic drawings, trying to understand the twist of the figure, the movement. And we can see, you know, the different ways the figures are, you know, understanding him in the round, but really looking for the dynamic energy. And again, this idea of like drawing as design. So if we think about the things you're learning here, so we have a contrapposto figure in the center, and then this is the Renaissance. So we're moving away from the medieval thing of the absolute symmetry either side, but instead we have balance. So we have the center line and Christ occupying the negative spaces slightly differently, and even the contrapposto itself is balance but not symmetry. Off to the left, hand down, back hand up, head looking down. Here, front hand up, covering the face, back hand down. So there's a kind of an echo in space. And the way that the negative spaces are, you know, filled with gap between, very little gap, space here, tilted over. And the more you look at it, the more clever and fluid and playful you realize the way that he's composing this actually rather grim image of a man being whipped to an inch of his life before he gets stuck on a cross. And again, you know, the idea of the art of Florence being absolutely rooted in the idea of drawing, not just as drawing as copying a shape, but drawing as disegno. And this is not the kind of drawing, let's say a cartone, a transfer drawing. These are the quick studies to try and find the energy, the gesture, the sense of movement. And for something like that, you know, a pen is is an ideal medium. We can move on. Can anyone see the little holes? Can you all see the little holes here? Yeah, does anyone know what those are for? Yeah, exactly. So we're now looking at drawings. This is a preparatory drawing that would be transferred either to a fresco or maybe a panel, or it's a transfer drawing. It's a working drawing. And so these little holes, for those of you that don't know, you'd punch these little holes, and then you'd rub a kind of charcoal dust. You'd have a little bag with pigment in it, and they'd be put over. And so either the wall for the fresco or the panel, which had been prepared with a lighter ground, you could then kind of fill in those gaps, and you'd have your shape really established. We don't use this method to transfer in the school, but historically it was actually very, very popular. And even the Lawrence paint drawing we saw earlier had a few of these little marks around the edge as well. This one I love. This is it's not a great reproduction. Can you see the splatters here? So this is by an artist called Pietro da Cortona, who's a 17th century painter, and he did, when it's open again, if you go to the Palazzo Pitti in the main rooms on the first floor, and you look up, he painted these amazing frescoes in the ceiling about the education of a prince. This is one of the figures from the ceiling, and he was using this drawing. We can tell that because these are the same colors that are in the ceiling. So he had this stuck there, or had it resting on the scaffold, and the paints just dripped down. And so this, one of the things I love about painting and drawing is it takes you directly to the act of creation, because we know he made those marks deliberately, and then we also see the marks he made undeliberately too. And so I find this, looking at a drawing like this, you feel this unbelievably direct connection to the mid-17th century when these frescoes are being done, and you know then this is a working drawing. This is drawing as an act of preparation for the painting, or a way of how do I move my idea from my brain to the paper and then into the finished work. Another way we can move things. These are two 19th century drawings now. These are studies by Ang. It's interesting, if you look at something like Degas, his drawings in his early stage are remarkably similar to this. I think one of the fascinating things about this training that you're all getting is if you take, let's say, Degas, Picasso, and Sargent, who are three artists who their mature work is so unbelievably different, and you look at the types of drawings they did as students, and they're unbelievably similar. And I think there's always the danger, I think most of you have come past that question just by coming here, but I think a lot of people are so afraid that this sort of training is going to be some huge block in my route to self-realization and self-expression. And actually history shows us that it's exactly the opposite of that. So this is Ang on the left, and this is a form of transfer where he's creating a kind of a grid, which can then be scaled up. So the painting might be twice as big or 3 times as big. So let's assume, imagine this is going to so the painting is going to be twice as big. You just create a grid where each square is twice as large and so on. I personally prefer to transfer this way rather than transferring with by creating a negative. And then on the right is a Bouguereau drawing, which is the kind of finished drawing he would then use to give him certain information. Probably not to finish the painting, but you could go a long way with the drawing that was resolved to that level. And a similar type of idea. This is going back to the Renaissance. If I had to choose one artist, if I had the money to have a collection of their drawings, for me it would be Pontormo. I also just love how bizarrely, in a way, different his paintings are than his drawings in terms of the choices of color. But I think Bouguereau is a great draftsman, but I personally find the relationship between the internal forms and the external contour even more exciting and dynamic, even though the pose itself is actually is relatively restful. Just that dynamic, rippling sense of form as we come from the rib cage over the pelvis and into that leg. The use of accent. To me, it's a musical thing. If you're listening at time, I don't know, to something like Beethoven, there are moments which seem completely illogical in the moment, and then when you hear the whole piece, you understand, and that moment seems completely inevitable. And I find, looking at Pontormo's drawings, I find the same thing. His use of accent, his use of line, the drawing itself absolutely makes sense, but if you actually look at individual moments, it seems almost counterintuitive. And I find the Bouguereau a little more controlled and predictable in that way. It's a beautiful drawing, and he's a great draftsman, but I find a slightly greater sense of mystery and wonder in the face of something like this. This works beautifully on a figurative level, and I find this is also absolutely a triumph as an abstract thing as well. We could look at that for hours, but we have to move on. Again, this is a little Ribera piece. I could have put this with the landscape things. This is a man kind of being bound to a tree, probably another kind of Marsyas type figure. And what I think is interesting with Ribera is that, for me, even the tree here takes on almost a human form. I mean, this almost looks like a torso, like the navel, the belly button here, the splayed arms. And there's some sort of echo between man and nature. And this thing of the idea that he moves his chalk, he moves his pencil like nature. It's not an imposition. His hand is always responding and moving in a natural way. Okay, another preparatory drawing. I think this is one of the miracles of drawing that exists in this country. It's in a museum called the Ambrosiana, so it's right in the center of Milan. And this is the study for the cartoon. So the word we use, cartoon, comes from the Italian word carta, for paper, and cartone just means big paper. Actually, in this case, it's not really true, because this is almost like a quilt of lots of little pieces of paper. So there's about 220 pieces of paper sort of stitched and glued together to make this particular drawing. But it's the finished preparatory drawing that Raphael would have put up either in whole or in sections onto the wall in the Vatican to make this. And we're going to get up a little bit closer now to see it in a little bit more detail. And the School of Athens, we'll be here all night trying to explain it completely, but it's part of the job of high Renaissance artists very often with these types of commissions was to show how classical civilization, classical culture could be adapted to suit a Christian purpose. So we have Plato and Socrates in the middle, one pointing up, one pointing down. We've got various other people like Pythagoras we'll see in a second as well. And a cast of other characters we don't always entirely recognize. We have Raphael, possibly himself over here or over here. No one's quite sure. The one big change is this guy. So if we go back to the cartoon, we can see a gaping hole here in the center of the composition. And in the finished painting, does anyone know who this is? Yeah. So at the same moment that Raphael was painting this in the sort of the private apartments, Michelangelo was sort of in between stages on the Sistine Chapel. And there are all these stories about how Raphael would sneak in to the Sistine Chapel to go and see Michelangelo at work, and Michelangelo was furious. And this is a kind of homage. I think there's also a flip side that actually once, these are painted in about 1512, and the phase, the frescoes that Michelangelo painted in that first phase after 1512 on the ceiling, actually I think have a greater level of linear grace. And I think that for all the cult of Michelangelo that we get through Vasari, I think Michelangelo, for all of his jealousy of his younger rival, possibly had gone in to see the Raphael frescoes as well and took a little bit of something from them too. Michelangelo was, for all of his difficulty, was quite a smart guy. But I find anyway that there's a linear grace that comes in the second phase of Michelangelo's initial decoration, and it's not inconceivable that came from looking at Raphael. So Raphael acknowledges, we see the monumentality of this figure, those enormous knees. Here we have these rather sort of delicate, sort of cerebral figures, gesturing and talking, and then we have this enormous kind of contemplative lump here in the foreground, and that monumentality, particularly of that knee, is so obviously a homage to those statuesque forms he'd seen on the ceiling. Maybe we can move in a bit closer. And again, this idea of artistic decisions. There's almost, because Raphael's painting style, and this is the joy of looking at these, that when we're dealing with some of these Renaissance artists, their finished paintings are so perfect. The surface is completely flawless. There are no brushstrokes visible. There are no changes visible, unless we look at X-rays sometimes. And they can seem a little intimidating in their completeness. And I think the wonderful thing about looking at these is we really sense that, look how many times he changed the position of the arm. Is that just a question of it being accurate, or is he just trying to make a more beautiful shape, a better shape? It's hard to give a definitive answer. But I think it is interesting when we start to look at the whole painting and you spend enough time there and you start trying to analyze, why did the hand move to the left or to the right? And it's almost like having a conversation with the artist. It's not a perfect conversation. It's not a complete one, but it's about as good as it's going to get. I'm not really a Ouija board fan. And if you want to talk to the dead and dead artists to try and get advice from them, I think really studying the preparatory work is often the best way to get inside their head. Just think too as we move through, think of all the different hand gestures, every head, at a different angle, eyes in different directions. there's so little repetition. And think how easy it is just drawing one figure or one barg, how easy it is to end up creating repetitive and boring forms and just try and find like an ugly shape or a boring shape. How beautifully designed the hair is. And we have a guy with kind of a sort of a sprouting from the center hairdo, someone else with a long hairdo, we've got a bald guy here, hair hanging down. Every single thing that you can find variety and beauty and interest in. Imagine like squeezing a lemon. I think half the time we sort of squeeze it a bit and then toss it away, and he's really, with every single possibility here, has kind of squeezed every part of it out. Same thing again. I think this is meant to be Pythagoras doing his triangles. How many of you have studied geometry at school? I hate that guy. Even his finger's a little sort of horrible little triangle shape. There he is up close. Again, you can see them all kind of like looking in. It's like art's most sort of eloquent math lesson. I think it's just so interesting. Also, I think the other thing that's so interesting is just like the variety of solutions, the variety of ways he uses to describe form. Matteo's been doing drapery, I think with Simona's help as well. And Matteo and Simona have come up with this drapery course. And just think of all the different ways that folds are designed, the compositional rhythm in the folds. It's not just cloth to look like cloth, but the cloth has a very specific compositional function as well. You see here all the different pieces of paper, the seams in them. Look at all the different solutions to hands. There's probably about 9 fingers in that hand. And eventually, it's the one he wanted. And how small those changes are, but how much he cared enough to try and get absolutely what he felt was the most compelling, the most correct, not in the sense of, let's say, academic correctness, but correct in terms of the rhythms of the whole painting. You've got these sweeps here in the drapery, and the hands are kind of picking up that rhythm and that movement. And then, so the next stage for an artist like Raphael, this is, I think, one of the most, possibly one of the most beautiful drawings. There's a show at the Ashmolean in Oxford a couple of years ago, and this was kind of on a wall by itself at the very end. And the woman who put it together, she described Raphael as the artist who drew the most eloquent hands. If the word eloquent doesn't kind of register with you, eloquence is if you're speaking and you're speaking very clearly and making your point very beautifully. Eloquence is the ability to use language to communicate an idea in a beautiful and compelling way. And we think about the way that Raphael drew hands, and I think these are some of the most eloquent hands, but also just the Leonardo love of 2 different facial types, the young boy, sort of the beautiful young boy, and then the older man. So we really feel, by putting those 2 things together, literally like light and dark, by having 2 absolutely essential things next to each other, you exaggerate or strengthen the inherent qualities of each one. Again, just, the beautiful way the hair is described. There are a lot of kind of, let's say, sort of contemporary artists in our world who've chosen to completely ignore hair when they draw the human head. And I think when you see what Raphael does with that space, you realize how much people are missing out when they don't choose those rhythms, and how much, the different character of the hair in each head. It's not just a sort of a box. And so this would be from this he would probably do a large. The painting was going to be colored, especially in fresco, because you don't paint from life. Would be colored via formula, but the forms were chosen and adapted through drawing. So you work from the cartoon, which gives you the general and the composition and the bigger rhythms, and then this is actually for an oil painting of the Transfiguration, but this would give you the smaller, more specific information from which you would then make the rest of the painting. And I think it's one of the great tests when you're doing the preparatory studies. Your pencil study for the gesture, the charcoal value study for the light effect. Think how many days or how far could I take these 2 things? How complete, how resolved a drawing could I make from this? If the model simply couldn't come anymore, how far could I go? I think it's a really good, as I said, not what are the, not how long did it take me, but what are the qualities of my drawing? How resolved a final work could I make from those? And I think, with sort of well-mixed colors, which your assistant would make for you, you could do a lot from those drawings. There's so much information there about the forms, the transitions, the intensity of light, and so on. Can anyone guess who made this? It's another drawing by a sculptor. This is Bernini. So we're now, again, back in Rome again. And this is drawing not as a study, this is just drawing for the pure pleasure of drawing. Nothing came out of this, in a sense. So we're back to that, almost that Sargent and Bernini idea from the beginning. It's a kind of a presentation drawing. He's just making this drawing for the love of the material, for the love of the actual activity itself. I've got a detail of it here. Again, just thinking about the variety of line, variety of edges, use of accent. Introducing white chalk, which is a little bit further down the road for some of you. For some of you, you're really getting into that stuff now as well. And again, I think I gave you this quote in the first lecture, but this guy called Kenneth Clark, who wrote a number of really good books on painting, and in one of his things on landscape painting, he says, facts become art through love. And I think, what's so interesting about an elbow and an armpit in themselves, I mean, not much, it's quite banal. And then when we see them drawn here, it's impossible not to feel some sort of emotional or some sort of wondrous reaction to it. And you don't draw something like, on that level unless there is actually that love for both the activity and the thing you're drawing. Again, this is an academic study by Annibale Carracci. So we're now in Bologna. Again, a drawing that doesn't have any purpose. This is Rembrandt drawing an old man. And again, I think it's so interesting to see we're here, like, for the most part, producing very highly finished, highly resolved drawings, but also how much can be said by a small number of really well-chosen lines. Just cut him off in the heart and in half here, and just look at the top part and just think how many times his pencil actually touched the surface of the paper, and yet with that, or just the head even, and yet we get so much from that head. We have a sense of someone who's, let's say, slightly beaten down by the world, someone who's slightly unsure, possibly. Just yourself quietly in your own mind, just play kind of word association with this character, and just think how evocative these few lines are. We imagine a whole world for this person so quickly. There was this big show of Rembrandt's work about a year and a half ago in Amsterdam at the Rijksmuseum. And for me, it was probably one of the most exhausting experiences I've ever had in a museum, just purely because every figure you saw demanded that interaction with it. There wasn't a single person that you were indifferent to or a single object that you were indifferent to. Everything was given a specific character, a specific narrative, and it didn't matter whether it was a really finished painting or just a scribble. You felt this compelling desire to get to know every person. I think that's the kind of the miracle of a drawing like this. And then a more modern drawing. And yeah, we're still in Holland. Does anyone want to guess who did this? We don't talk about him that much here, but actually as a draftsman we probably should. Van Gogh, yeah. And I talked about this with the students with Ramiro a few weeks ago. We were doing a lecture on hands, and we were talking then about the idea that just imagine what a different feeling we get if her hands were, let's say here, clasped together and she was praying. So just how these little choices, again, this idea of, you're not necessarily you're not necessarily making art, but you are making artistic decisions all the time. And I think looking at a drawing like this, or any drawing, and just imagining the path not taken. So imagine the hand to the right, or to the left, or up, or down. Or if I unclench my fist and I do this, what am I saying, or what does my figure say? And just spending, think how long it took him to draw this, at a guess. I mean, anyone just say, how long do you think it would take to make a drawing like this, roughly? Yeah, a couple of hours. How long do we normally spend looking at it if we were to see it in a museum? Likely. Probably at most, if we're being honest about it, we might pass it and say, this is really cool, but I'm going to give it 10 minutes. Think about what you might learn from it in 2 hours, or if we go back to even this in 2 hours, or if we were to spend 2 hours in front of something like this, and you start thinking, well, okay, what would the drawing look like if the hand was in front of his back? And just take it apart. And I think when you start to look at things for that long and in that way, the mechanics, not just of the physical act of drawing, but the act of arranging, which is that really significant second string of disegno, becomes so much more alive. Or why is that there? Maybe he doesn't want a drawing that's about a butt crack. No, I'm serious though. I mean, like, there's an element of, let's say, not politeness in the boring way of like, are you using the right fork at dinner? No, that's irrelevant, I think, these days. But like, just imagine there's some great big dark line here. Suddenly, maybe our focus would be somewhere else, or he just doesn't want us to be distracted by it. We want to be up here. And so maybe this little shape helps us to make the drawing not politer in a boring sense, but helps us to enjoy this without any other distractions. So again, maybe when we look at this normally, we'd be so distracted by, let's say, the technical part of this. But there's a whole other part of the language which is actually just enjoying and thinking about, why is the tree branch at that angle rather than, say, there? Bernini thought about it, definitely, or maybe he didn't think about it, maybe it's intuitive by that point because he'd drawn so many times, but it's still a decision. And I think looking at drawings as a series of artistic decisions is a really important strain of being a student of art and a student of drawing. Rubens, again, just playing. It's a man wrestling a lion. You can sort of see it in there somewhere. And again, just the joy of making different shapes, testing out solutions, red chalk, black chalk, a few little white highlights in there as well. And a completely different way of interpreting form, much more based on, they're still straight lines, but he really enjoys breaking the straighter angles into things that appear as curves as well, and there are actually some curved lines. Just the energy that you get from a drawing like that. And then we've got other types of drawing. This is a portrait drawing by John Singer Sargent. And this was the point in his life where he was being kind of completely besieged by patrons wanting their portrait done in oils, and he couldn't really be bothered anymore. He wanted to be in the mountains of Switzerland. Is it the most interesting drawing of all time? No, but I think in terms of the way that things are simplified, the way that focal points are created, a different type of medium now. So this is charcoal on a life-size scale. So most of the drawings we've been seeing so far are kind of small and intimate, and suddenly now we're on or very, very close to working on the life size. And again, would a pencil drawing on a life size work? Maybe not. Maybe the mark is a little too small for that size. Charcoal allows that broader, more kind of smoky, mass-based treatment, which is more appropriate for a life-size image. Think how long it would take to fill in that in pencil. And he's got an hour and a half with this woman who has a busy social life. This is a pencil portrait. This is Repin, the Russian artist, drawing his friend Tolstoy. And again, I think just the idea of how much you can say with minimal means. We get a sense of the man, the concentration, his role in life. I think one of the really interesting parts when you're looking at a portrait is this tension between vanity and vulnerability. So the vanity, the willingness to be, I want to be painted, I want to be drawn, and then the vulnerability of the individual character. And I think as modern artists, we tend to be interested in the vulnerabilities of people. I think if you go back to someone like a Van Dyck or a Titian, they had a slightly more sensitive balance between the vanity and the vulnerability. And there's also the individual, who Tolstoy was, and the archetype, the writer. And so if you look at this drawing and you think, okay, there's the general idea of the writer, and then the individual who's writing, and then do we sense any vanity here? Maybe not so much, but it's not completely vulnerable. There's a bulk to him. There's the way that he dominates the space. There's to some extent the luxury or the beauty of some of the objects around him. So it's not a completely, let's say, we don't sense someone who has. If you think about, let's say, a Francis Bacon portrait, or a certain Goya portraits, where we really feel the sense of the closeness to a very disturbed individual. It's not that type of vulnerability, but it's definitely not. It's not a pompous portrait in any sense. So that idea of vulnerability and vanity, and then the archetype and the individual. And I find it's quite an interesting way to look at a portrait, is seeing how the artist explored those different impulses. This is very much about vanity for me. If you want to, there are sort of certain painters in the history of art where if you want to look as sort of sexy as possible, kind of the Tinder photo, you get Sargent. Goya, maybe you keep something a little more private. And I think this is a very, to me, the fascinating thing is how certain artists, and I think in this case Repin, manages to navigate a very successful way of finding a route through those tensions. Do you all know who did this? German artist. Yeah, Holbein, good. Yeah. Again, this is kind of a study for, well, this is I don't know if this painting actually exists anymore, but this is kind of how he would produce the preliminary studies for the paintings. These very kind of crisp lines that define the face, and then this kind of looser, slightly more suggestive way of designing the lower part. But just the clarity with which he sees the precise mapping out of the features. I should have found one where we can see the painting and the drawing together. It would have made some of the decision making even clearer. But you can do that in your own time. So if you Holbein, Holbein, Hans Holbein the Younger, and see if you can find online versions. It's a really interesting bit of research. How he translated drawings into paintings, where he groups things together, other things that he pulled apart. And once you start to get to know the paintings, this is where the research becomes interesting, because if you've seen a few Holbein paintings, you can sort of imagine what the painting is going to look like. The color would be white. This would probably all be pretty dark. The hair and the hat would be kind of almost one tone. The background would be probably a kind of a color, but if you squinted it, it would be a value. And you can sort of fill in the gaps. And I think that idea of the drawing as a form of shorthand, and in a sense, what you're learning to do as draftsmen or draftspeople is learning how to create your own shorthand. You're learning principles like proportion and understanding of light and line, but also through the 3 years, you're going to be understanding how I can use something to make something else. Portrait drawing by the French artist Ingres, similar kind of idea. He's very much in the Holbein tradition, the slightly tighter treatment of the face and the slightly more suggestive way of treating the drapery down below. And I wanted to, I remember a few years ago, Simona actually spoke a little bit about this drawing. So in honor of her, Raphael's, who we looked a lot at tonight, is from Urbino, which is out towards Pesaro, which is also a part of the world that Simona knows very well. And what I wanted to do, I think it's is, I'm going to ask a few of you, I'll give you a second or two to think about it. When you're looking at whether it's your own work or other people's work, what are its qualities? So I just want you to think about what are the. I'll give you all about 10 seconds. I'm going to start picking on people. What qualities do you think this drawing possesses? So why do you think I respond to it? Why do you think Simona might respond to it? Why do you respond to it? If you don't, it's not a problem. If you really don't get anything from it, think back, and if you can think of one of the other images you've seen that you've liked, if I pick on you, then say, actually, can we go back a few, and we'll talk about something else. But I'll give you 10 seconds now. I just want you to think of, a word that you think is, what qualities.
It has a sensual expression. It's very
expressive. What do you think the person's doing or feeling? Hope, yeah, okay. Anyone else want to think of a quality? Yeah, you.
She seems like beseeching, begging.
Yeah, imploring or asking for something, yeah? And then in a more, let's say, academic way, so in terms of, let's say, process or technique, do you want to give me one?
Sure, I think I would say movement.
Yeah, movement.
Tension, like she's asking for help.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we have the sense of, let's say, reaching towards something or asking for something. Okay, we've got movement. Simona, do you want to add anything?
To me, this is a beautiful drawing that explains very well the gesture.
Yeah, gesture.
And that gesture is explained by a so sensitive line, contour, outline.
You look at the thigh, and you think how round it seems. And I think you use the word movement, but there's also this, at the same time, there's also this sense of monumentality, and there's that tension between movement, which is sort of flickering, and the monumental, which is static. And I think that's a really interesting tension in the drawing. And to think about what Simona was saying, how he uses line and accent, sharp, simple lines, vibrating lines, to describe the three-dimensionality of the form. At the fleshiest, softest point, we have this kind of vibrating line. As you move into harder areas, the line gets a bit more defined. An active muscle is described differently to other parts that are softer and more resting. There's even a form of, in a very shallow sense, of atmospheric perspective. We really feel through the weight of these lines that they're in front of those ones. there's so much subtlety, so much you can say through line. I think it's a sort of recurring theme in the final critiques for Simona's program, is just the importance and the beauty and the possibility of line. And I wanted to end with this drawing because I think it's if Raphael produced eloquent hands, he was also a very eloquent example of how beautiful and how much you can say with line. So that's that.